At dawn on a cold October morning in 1917, a woman was led across the damp cobblestones of a military courtyard in Paris. She moved with a strange grace. Even as guards surrounded her, even as a firing squad waited in the distance with rifles raised. Her silk shawl brushed against the ground, her steps measured as if she were walking onto a stage one final time. The soldiers tied a blindfold over her eyes, but witnesses whispered that she refused to tremble. She stood tall, her chin lifted, the outline of her face calm in the pale light of the hour. To the French authorities, she was a traitor, a spy who had whispered secrets to the enemy, a woman so dangerous she had to be silenced. To others, she was something more complicated, an artist, a courtesan, a symbol of glamour who had lived too freely in a world at war. In that moment, the rifles fired and her body crumpled to the ground. The silence that followed carried a question that has never fully been answered. Had justice been served, or had fear demanded a sacrifice? She had once been called the most desirable woman in Europe, but in death she became the most dangerous. And as history looked back, the mystery only deepened. Who truly was Mata Hari? A master of deception who played both sides in the deadliest conflict the world had yet seen, or a scapegoat condemned to die because her life was too easy to cast as treachery. The story of Mata Hari begins far from the stage lights of Paris in the late 19th century, when Europe was restless with change and empires strained to maintain control. Born into a family of modest means in the Netherlands, she was not destined for the wealth or influence that her later name would suggest. Her father's business failed, her family fractured, and by the time she reached young adulthood, she had learned that survival required more than patience. It required reinvention. Marriage seemed at first to offer escape, as she left her homeland for the colonies, traveling to the distant Dutch East Indies. There, however, she discovered not stability, but brutality. The marriage was poisoned by violence and betrayal, her husband's temper leaving deep scars on her sense of safety and belonging. It was in that place of exile that she first encountered the dances and costumes of the East, absorbing gestures and rituals that would later shape the performances which made her famous. When the marriage collapsed, she returned to Europe, stripped of security but armed with the instinct to create a new self. In Paris, she adopted the name Mata Hari, meaning Eye of the Day in Malay, and with it, she constructed a persona that was larger than life. Draped in silks, adorned with jewels, she danced in movements that seemed both ritualistic and forbidden. Her body telling stories of gods and legends no one in Paris truly understood, but all were eager to believe. She did not simply perform, she transformed into mystery itself, allowing men of influence to see in her what they most desired: danger, exoticism, and forbidden knowledge. Yet beneath the glow of adoration, shadows gathered. The world beyond the stage was drifting into war, and fascination with a woman who embodied secrecy would soon turn into suspicion. What began as performance would slowly be recast as espionage, and every look, every gesture, every whispered conversation would take on darker meaning in the years to come. As the clouds of war gathered over Europe in 1914, Mata Hari's world of elegance and illusion collided with a continent unraveling. Paris, once her playground of theaters and salons, grew tense with suspicion as soldiers filled the streets and whispers of spies spread from cafe to cafe. For a woman like her, who crossed borders with ease and mingled with generals, diplomats, and wealthy patrons, the shift in perception was inevitable. Where once she had been admired for her beauty and independence, now every movement was watched through the lens of paranoia. She continued her travels, appearing in hotels and ballrooms across Europe. But with each journey came questions. Who was she meeting, and why? She sought the companionship of officers, men who basked in her charm, men who confided secrets after wine and whispered promises. Some believed she was careless. Others believed she was deliberate. In Berlin, her presence raised brows. In Paris, it invited accusations. Rumors began to coil around her name like smoke. The French suspected she traded intelligence with the Germans. The Germans suspected she offered her loyalty to the French, and both sides began to see in her a figure too fluid to be trusted. The contradictions multiplied. Her lovers were men of power, yet she often begged for money. She spoke of loyalty, yet her movements suggested otherwise. By 1916, her glamour no longer shielded her. She was a woman walking across a battlefield of suspicion, and every step pulled her deeper into danger. What had begun as a life of performance now carried the weight of espionage. The same allure that had drawn crowds was recast as manipulation, and the question burned hotter with each passing day. Was Mata Hari truly weaving secrets between nations? Or was she simply trapped in a role that war itself had written for her? The case against Mata Hari hardened in shadows, built from fragments of intercepted messages, coded telegrams, and testimonies collected under the strain of war. French military intelligence claimed that German communications referred to an agent known as H-21, and they insisted that this mysterious figure was Mata Hari. To them, her travels across borders, her liaisons with military officers, and her sudden access to money were not the movements of a dancer clinging to her fading fame, but the careful operations of a spy. Surveillance reports painted her as a woman who lingered too long in conversations with men in uniform, who accepted gifts that could only be payment for secrets. Yet when examined closely, much of the evidence dissolved into ambiguity. Telegrams were vague, names obscured, dates unclear. What was presented as certainty was often assumption dressed in official language. Even her alleged admissions, drawn out in interrogations, were laced with contradictions. At times she confessed to small exchanges. At others she denied any involvement, as if unsure of what truth might still save her. Psychologists would later argue that her trial was not only about espionage, but about the fear of a woman who refused to obey the boundaries set for her. She had crafted herself into an object of power, using allure and performance to survive, and in an era of fear, that power was recast as treachery. The authorities saw not just a spy, but a symbol that could be sacrificed to reassure a nation crumbling under the weight of war. The deeper investigators dug, the more the lines blurred. Was she a clever manipulator, moving information between borders, or a lonely woman who overstated her importance in a desperate attempt to remain relevant? The evidence promised answers, yet what it delivered was a maze of uncertainty, where every path led not to clarity, but to suspicion. The truth of Mata Hari's role in the war remained hidden behind the same veils of illusion she had once worn on stage. And perhaps that was the most dangerous secret of all. Prison stripped Mata Hari of the illusions she had spent her life weaving. The silks and jewels that once cloaked her body were replaced with coarse garments, and the walls that surrounded her were not lined with admiring faces, but with cold stone and silence. In the isolation of Saint Lazare prison, the woman who had danced before kings and generals was reduced to a figure pacing in darkness, waiting for a verdict she could not escape. Letters from friends dwindled, visits grew rare, and the world that had once applauded her now looked upon her with suspicion and disdain. She had always been skilled at performance, but here no stage could be found, and no mask could protect her from the crushing weight of her fate. The confidence she had carried into interrogation began to erode, replaced by long stretches of silence where her thoughts folded back upon themselves. To those who guarded her, she seemed restless yet resigned, sometimes fierce, sometimes broken. What haunted her most was not the walls themselves, but the knowledge that she had been abandoned by the very men who had once sworn affection, men who now found it safer to let her burn than to speak her name. Outside the prison, France trembled under the weight of war. Families mourned sons who would never return. Streets echoed with rumors of traitors and spies, and the need for someone to blame grew urgent. Within that fevered atmosphere, Mata Hari was less a person than a vessel for fear, a woman unto whom a nation could project its anxieties. The emotional toll consumed her from within, as each passing day forced her to confront the widening gap between who she had been and what she was accused of being. Once celebrated as a goddess of dance, she was now branded a phantom of betrayal. In her solitude, she must have wondered if her end had already been written the moment she dared to step into a world where beauty and power belonged only to men, and whether she was awaiting justice or sacrifice. The trial of Mata Hari unfolded not as a careful weighing of evidence, but as a performance crafted for an audience desperate for certainty in a time of chaos. It was conducted in secrecy, behind closed doors, but its consequences echoed loudly across France. Prosecutors presented her not simply as a woman accused of espionage, but as a creature of deception, a siren who seduced officers into surrendering secrets, a figure who embodied the fears of a nation that felt surrounded by enemies. Witnesses spoke of her movements between Berlin, Madrid, and Paris, framing her travels as proof of treachery rather than the erratic wanderings of a woman surviving through the only means she knew. Telegrams intercepted by intelligence were cited as undeniable proof, though experts later questioned their translation, their context, and even their authenticity. Yet to the tribunal, doubt mattered little. The narrative had already been chosen. Mata Hari was guilty. Theories swirled both then and long after her execution. Some believed she had truly worked for the Germans, exchanging secrets for money to maintain her extravagant lifestyle. Others insisted she played both sides, a reckless double agent who lacked the discipline of true espionage and inevitably fell into her own web. A growing number, however, viewed her as innocent, a scapegoat sacrificed to satisfy public outrage, condemned less for what she had done than for what she represented. She was a woman who moved too freely, who crossed borders and defied boundaries, and in the paranoia of war, such freedom was intolerable. Even today, historians debate whether Mata Hari betrayed her adopted country, or whether she was condemned by myth, rumor, and fear. The investigation left behind contradictions, destroyed files, and gaps too wide to bridge. All that remains is the uneasy certainty that her trial revealed more about the desperation of a nation than the guilt of the woman before them at dawn on October 15th, 1917. The courtyard of Vincennes was cloaked in a heavy mist, as if the earth itself sought to hide what was about to take place. Mata Hari, wrapped in a simple coat, was led forward by guards whose boots struck the stones with rhythmic fidelity. Witnesses later whispered that she did not falter, that her head remained high, and that when offered a blindfold she refused it, choosing instead to stare directly at the rifles aimed at her chest. In that moment she was neither dancer nor spy, neither goddess nor scapegoat, but a solitary figure standing before the abyss. The command was given. The rifles cracked through the morning air, and her body crumpled to the ground, absorbed into silence. Yet her death did not end the story. It only deepened the mystery. The woman once adored for her grace and condemned for her secrets became an eternal question, a symbol of how fear and desire intertwine in times of war. Was she truly the most dangerous woman of the Great War, slipping secrets through whispers and embraces, or was she merely convenient, a figure chosen to bear the weight of a nation's paranoia? The stage she once ruled had been replaced by history's theater, where her life is endlessly reenacted in fragments of rumor, testimony, and speculation. And as her name lingers, whispered in books, films, and memory, it reminds us of how thin the line is between myth and truth, between justice and sacrifice. Perhaps that is why her story endures, not because we know what she was, but because we never will. If this story left you haunted by questions that have no answer, imagine what else lies buried in history's shadows. Press like if you felt the weight of Mata Hari's fate, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the darkness beneath the past.